Um, I don't know if you have to mow the grass where you live or you have somebody do it or whatever. I just kind of noticed that doing it a little less than I was earlier in the summer and through the summer. And I mentioned that to my wife the other day. And of course, recently I let it grow a little bit more, and kind of where it needed trimming, it was really looking scruffy. But I just didn't want it to, because it was dry, I just didn't want it to burn out and turn brown right away and remind me that, cold weather's coming. And so I let it go a little bit and tried to keep it as green as we could. Well, the day of redemption came. I needed to mow it and trim it and make it look like it was redeemed and not just going wild and letting it do what it wants. And so mowed it and trimmed it. There's a few spots I forgot to trim by the wood pile, but I wasn't that motivated to go get the trimmer back out and go do it. So, that'll be fine. And finished, and and I'm not a meticulous groomer of the grass, and I'm not out there digging out dandelions that creep over into our yard from the neighbors, and I'm just I'm not going to do that. I might do that if my yard was this big, but when it's about an acre, I'm not going to get out there and dig. And I know you're like, well, they have chemicals and I know they do. So anyhow, not meticulous with the grass, but just got it done. Put the mower away and trimmer away, and not that I didn't have anything else to do, but I went out on this walkout level, and there's a little deck there, and sat in a chair, looked at the yard, and I thought, that looks better. That looks good. I mean, it's not perfect. Some of you have much higher standards, and you're meticulous and all of that, but I sat there and I went, this is good. And I took a moment and just kind of rested. And, I thought about, God uses the things of this life, natural principles, things around us, to speak to us and show us spiritual truths and all of that. And, and I was out there mowing the grass, and for a lot of it, I'm not really mowing grass, I'm mowing weeds, and thinking, yeah, that came because of sin. We look back in Genesis, and those weeds, they showed up because of sin. And now what was supposed to be a joy and work can turn to a burden for us. We see that transition in Genesis. God placed Adam in the garden, and he was supposed to kind of work it and maintain it. And then after sin, this is going to be toilsome now for you. And the briars and the thorns and all the weeds, those kind of things. And so we get acquainted with the result of sin in the physical world, and we make the parallels that in our own life when we sin, there are these things that are unwanted. They were not supposed to be there, and they choke other things out that are good. And so you see this spiritual principle at work just in my yard, and sat there and then looked at the spiritual principle of, hey, I got this work done. I sat here for a moment, and the yard looked redeemed. It's like it got saved, and it sat there, and I said, this is good. This is good. This is very good. And took a moment and rested, and started thinking about what God did in the garden, and started to equate that over into the days we're living. And there's so much unrest. And look at the days we're living where, sometimes in our culture, pre-COVID and since, we can have a very unhealthy relationship with work and or rest. If you look in Scripture and how God, purposed things, is there's supposed to be kind of this nice ebb and flow or rhythm, if you will, between work and rest. A lot of us love technology, and the beauty of it, you can get a lot done, Here's the downside, and I think this was the statistic. If not, it's very close. So forgive me for if I err in this a little bit, but you'll get the point. Technology now has allowed us to be in touch with our office or our work for 16 and a half hours on average. Because now you don't have to, not all of our jobs do we have to show up at a physical place of business to do our work. Now, some of us do. But for a lot of people now, and especially too with all that's going on with the COVID, we can work from anywhere. And they can get a hold of us at any time. And it puts us in touch with our work and responsibilities and email and text and phone call and etc. Where if you look back, a couple generations ago, you had to physically show up for that to happen, other than the occasional phone call. And then you had a landline, and if you weren't by it, you weren't getting a call. You weren't there to answer. And so it's changed the dynamics. And, in our culture, and not everybody believes this way, but you will hear phrases like the one I'm going to use here in a second, that has created this outlook on work that is unhealthy. Now, let me just say this. You and I are supposed to work, okay? We're supposed to work. Now, I know through this time there are some who've lost jobs or you have unemployment. Listen, these are windows of time, okay, that, we need help, there's a change, all of that. It's understandable. But in general, we're supposed to work. I mean, it's scriptures like this that, all that we put our hand to, we're supposed to do it unto the Lord. That's our worship to Him, is how we work and how much we work and how we conduct ourselves and the kind of performance that we do. It's supposed to be unto the Lord. You may have a supervisor and a boss and you work for them and all of that, and you are supposed to gladly submit to what they want done and all those things. But ultimately, our conduct in that and attitude in that is what our worship is to the Lord. It goes beyond the song on Sunday morning. And so that's under the Lord. It also says, if you don't work, you don't eat. There's other scriptures that talk about everyone should work in the house of God and be working, providing, so that you are not a burden to the body of Christ. Now, there are times that all of us need some benevolence in our life, whether it's help with something or provision, and there are times in our life. And we all believe in benevolence, and we all should be giving to benevolence, and we all recognize in humility there are times that I am not self-sufficient, and God gets to express His love to us through help and provision, and that's reasonable and acceptable. And so we understand that. In no way, shape, or form through this message this morning is there an excuse not to work. There's every reason to work. And we see God do it in the very beginning. He worked for 6 days. And the seventh day, it says He rested. I want to talk to us about this rest, this Sabbath, because we can very easily fall into this context that Sabbath is just simply about, I get a day where I'm supposed to physically rest, emotionally rest, mentally rest, and that's what the Sabbath is about. And I want you to know that is such a small piece of the Sabbath that God put in motion. And as believers, we forget about the spiritual truth of a Sabbath. And part of that is we look at rest as if I rest, I can't admit that I would be guilty. Nobody wants to confess to somebody else they took a nap. You don't want to be labeled as lazy. Or you don't want to, look like, well, gee, you were napping and I got all this stuff done. Well, I'm holier than you. My worship is better to the Lord than yours. We use phrases like this in our culture. I'll sleep when I'm dead. Well, it sounds really noble and like you work all day and all that. And I want you to know, maybe you're joking a little bit, but maybe there's some attitude and truth in that. And I want you to know that kind of phrase and mentality, because our mentality about work and rest is in a lot of cases different than many other places in the world. But as a believer, it doesn't matter where we live. There's a truth that what needs to be a part of our life that is about expressing faith and belief. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. And so, phrases like that, an attitude like that about work being more noble than rest, it's not one or the other. It's supposed to be a rhythm in our life. Work and rest. And so our spiritual life, the principles at work when we're, that are functioning while we work, but the spiritual principle that is at work when we're supposed to rest or when we do rest. And it's not just about going through the statistics of studies and science and humanity of, yes, your body needs rest after this many hours, and it needs nutrition, and you need emotional, rest, and you need, it helps your relationships. There's all of those reasons. But that is not the primary reason for a Sabbath. And so we're going to take a look at this morning, this whole idea that work. And he sat back for a moment and said, this is good. Now, I gave you a little flawed example of me sitting on the deck for a minute and looking at the yard and saying, whew, that's good. It's better. It's redeemed. It's not a perfect example, but it gives us a little bit of imagery, because you know what that is in your life. And it may not be cutting the grass. It might be some other project or something else you did, or you look at the junk drawer that got out of control and you can't close it, and you keep tucking papers in to get the thing closed, and a pen pops out, and finally you take it out and dump it and throw stuff out and reorganize it, and I don't even know why I have these 4 pens in there. They all ran out of ink, but I just keep putting them back in the drawer when they don't work. Those kind of things. And you look at the end and you go, hey, this is good. This is redeemed. Like, woohoo! And you have your own little celebration there. And I want you to look at, and I'll read this to you. If you want to turn there, you can. But Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Now, we can look at creation and all the things that he spoke into existence, and how it becomes perpetual, and it keeps growing, and there's life, and there's beauty, and there's order, and it just keeps happening. And he says, boy, this is good. This is very good. But he didn't make any of those things holy. It was the day of rest that he says, after all the work's done, he said, the seventh day I'm resting. He said, you know what? I'm making today holy. He didn't make anything else in creation say, oh, it's holy. And yet the seventh day, the day of rest is what he made holy. And you and I need to grasp a little bit of that and maybe think about that long beyond this message and say, what in my life am I making holy and so proud of and all of this? And God is calling something called rest holy. Maybe we have this unhealthy perspective of work and performance. Now, once again, you had better work, but you had better rest. And it's not just for the physical, emotional, and all of that, but for a very spiritual reason. God created a day, called it holy. A day of Sabbath, some day that is a rest. When we do that, God in creation instituted this. When we get to reflect that and acknowledge that and carry that out in our life, it's like we do a recreation. we don't change it. It's like we get to live it, relive it, recreate, recreation, recreation. Get it? It's a biblical word. We get to recreate, break from work. Now, Old Testament, they got hung up on all these laws. And I want you to know that salvation in the Old Testament and in the New Testament is the same way. It was always by faith. Abraham had faith, and therefore he did things. And those things he did as a result of his faith were credited to him as righteousness. That's no different than you and I. We are saved by grace through faith. And so they got involved in a lot of laws and how far they could walk and, where they could go and where they can't go on a Sabbath and all of these things. And then they had some exclusions that, well, if your ox is in a ditch, well, then you can go and get the ox out of the ditch. That's acceptable, but you can't be plowing with your ox and working on the Sabbath. And they came up with all kinds of rules, and they got hung up on works being for salvation. We know that Jesus came and fulfilled the law, and you and I, because of faith in him, what he did, we're forgiven, and now we should be empowered to live up to the law, and all of them are summed up in love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love people. And we show our love for him by obeying him. And so there's a faith that moves us to acts of faithfulness. Not acts of faithfulness, hoping that we're good enough. And so we get to look at what God institutes here. You see, one of the purpose of the Sabbath, one of the spiritual purposes is this. It's that every week we are remindful of a promise. A promise. One that's been fulfilled and one that we get to look forward to. The promise that we no longer have to be slaves to sin. That there is a day that's holy, that we honor God, where we get to rest and we don't make the journey and it's over and he's made a way. And it also helps us remember every week to look forward to a rest that's eternal. The promise. So we get to experience in the physical here a very spiritual principle. And it's not just about the body and our emotions and, all of that and, our mind and we need a break. It's not just that. It's about saying, you know what, you made a day holy. I want to worship you. I remember what you did. And so there's this day of rest that you bring that reminds me that there's a heaven to continue to have hope for, a time of rest where I don't toil in this life. I don't have to fight disease anymore. I don't have to fight sin anymore. I don't have to keep crucifying myself anymore. We have a promised land, a place in his presence that reminds us. If that just becomes a philosophy and lost, and we don't remember that, and we don't have something in our week to remind us about that promise, we're just kind of sailing through, doing our Christian activity, doing our Christian thing, and we forget that he made something holy, and we are making some other things holy that are not. That might be good, they might be acceptable, but not at the expense of sacrificing a remembrance every week somewhere that today is a Sabbath, it's a rest. It's God instituted this and made this holy. How can I go and just sail through that and not acknowledge it? Because it wipes away the fresh remembrance, the front burner of my mind, that there is a promise to be looking forward to and a hope for the eternal, for eternity. And yet the beauty is that he gives us a rest along the way. He gives us a a break, a Sabbath, a sabbatical, where we get to recognize that His promise is for us. There's a passage in Hebrews here that we're going to look at to help with this. And when you read it, it gets a little confusing. And so what I'm going to do is after I read it, I'm just going to kind of give you 5 little time periods that go along with this so we can kind of hang our hat on this and see, hey, this is why this is important. And it is panoramic through this whole Scripture, and it's still for us today. So in Hebrews, ending in chapter 3 and starting in chapter 4, this is what it says. Okay? Verse 18. And to whom did He swear, God, that they would not enter their rest or His rest, but to those who were disobedient? So what He's saying is, He made a promise. Those who are disobedient, they're not entering. They're not entering the rest. They don't get to. They don't get to enter eternity because of their disobedience. And disobedience is a result of what? Unbelief, right? Yeah. Unbelief causes rebellion and disobedience. So depending on your translation, you'll pick up some of those words. So he says this. So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. I want you to say this with me. The one thing that will stop me from entering the eternal rest is my choice to not believe. Unbelief. You don't have to keep repeating this. Now I'm preaching again. I wasn't clear in my directions, but you are so cooperative. Kudos to you. Listen, our unbelief is what keeps us out. And if we do not take time to honor in this life the holiness of what He created as a Sabbath, it's like we don't believe in it. And so now there is something that sets in slowly through time that causes us to be disobedient, and it can move us towards gradual unbelief. Don't kid yourself. Because now your Sabbath is just, philosophy, not worship, not practice, not remembering, not keeping the hope of rest for eternity, a hope for rest in this life. And so when we look at Hebrews here, he starts to go through and references 5 different time periods. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands. In other words, the gate's not closed. It's not too late for people to enter into that promise, into that rest. Let us fear. Now, the context here is we should take very serious, and it should have set off an alarm about our own salvation if we move anywhere close to unbelief and disobedience. That should create a legitimate insecurity about our salvation with the Lord. And we had better keep tabs on it, and we better make it right, because it's a very serious thing. And so that's what he's writing. You better have a little fear and trembling and working out your salvation if you're moving and starting to show signs of unbelief or not being faithful based upon faith and what God has called us to be and how He's called us to live. And so, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. In other words, that faith and that promise of reaching rest. For good news came to us just as to them, those before us. But the message they heard did not benefit them. Why? Because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest. As He has said, I swore in my wrath that they shall not enter my rest. although his works are finished from the foundation of the world, for he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And it goes on to talk about more of the same. And then he goes into 5 different time periods. I'm going to just paraphrase this. You can read it on your own in Hebrews 4, and maybe having these little points will help you digest it, because it can get a little confusing, at least for a guy like me. He goes through time periods. He starts with creation, which we talked about. God rested, and he called that day holy. And we're supposed to honor that in our life because he called it holy. Why? You ready for this great answer? I don't know, and he doesn't tell us. He chose to. How's that? Yeah, but why? He chose to. And if you honor him and believe, when you get there, you can ask. Okay? So, time period, he starts with creation. An example of work and rest and what is holy, and then just those things that are good. Very good. And then he moves to the example of the Israelites. He moves to when they were slaves, and they worked, and they worked, and they were oppressed, and they were beaten to the exhaustion and to death, and all of these things, working as slaves in Egypt. And God brought them out, and the prophecy of a promised land where they would not be slaves, but they would come out of slavery and they would have a rest from that life. It's like you and I. We were slaves to sin, but through faith in Christ, we now are moved from that, and we have a rest from condemnation. He has given us a power to overcome, right? By faith. We no longer are slaves to sin. We have a rest from that. Speaking of a promise that's fulfilled. And so here's the Israelites. They start to go through the wilderness to make their way to the promise. Well, you know the story. They start to wander around. Now, why did they wander around? Because when they started the journey, now they started to doubt and not believe. Therefore, they wandered, and they could not go into the promise because he swore, he said, those who do not believe will not enter. And through the testing of the journey, they lost faith. They gave up faith. They yielded over to their flesh, their thoughts, their complaints, their murmurings. And I want you to know there is a message there for you and I, that we have been brought out of slavery to sin, and we are on this journey to the promise. But along the way, if we come to a place where we're disobedient and we stop believing and we stop honoring God and living according to what he has set in motion for us spiritually and how we're supposed to live our life, I want you to know, we'll wander around, but we won't make it. You see, that is why we should work out our salvation with fear and trembling, with the gracious and merciful God who's made a way for us. But just hanging around with Christians and doing some Christian activity doesn't guarantee it. It's about in here and how we honor and show our obedience to God that we believe. Our faith gives us action that shows what we believe. And so he goes through this time period of work and rest, slaves and freedom, promises fulfilled, things to look forward to, and yet the principle that we get to enjoy it now. We don't have to just wait for eternity. There are places of rest along the way in this life. Hallelujah. And they remind us from the beginning all the way to the end that these are principles for us. and that God has made it holy. And so he talks it from creation. He gives the example of the Israelites. And then he brings them into the promise. Well, Joshua, okay, because Moses goes off the scene, and Joshua, okay, by the way, Moses, marvelous leader, but why did he not get to enter the promised land? He disobeyed God. He was told to speak to a rock that it would give water, and instead he struck it with his staff. He disobeyed God. And so he walks off before crossing over to the promise. Joshua becomes the leader. And Joshua, before they go over to the place of promise and rest, so they don't have to wander, keep, picking up camp and building it and picking up, but they can go and they can settle in a place flowing with milk and honey that God has promised them and bringing them to this place. Joshua, before he takes them over, he gives them rest. He gives them rest. To honor God and what he put in motion, but he also speaks of another day of rest. So understand that Joshua himself understood this from God, that it wasn't rest isn't until, just till we get to heaven. But there is rest in this life and what it's supposed to produce in us spiritually and remembering and fueling the hope for rest in this life and a rest that is to come. And so he refers to creation, refers to the Israelites, refers to Joshua, and then he refers to David. And you would find it in Psalm 95. And David talks about that this rest and this promise, and that it is still available. In his day, when he was writing, to those who would sing the song and who would read this, they would understand that this isn't just about history, that it's still available today, that we can honor God, be reminded of a hope and a holy day that is a spiritual worship to the Lord and honoring Him, and it reminds us and fuels us for the rest that is to come. David says, listen, the gate's not closed on this. There wasn't a dispensational period, and now it's closed, and well, that's what history, too bad for you guys. He said, no, it's still open, still available. And the fifth is that we move forward here to the book of Hebrews, and he is saying the same thing to us. It's not too late. You can still enter into this faith relationship that gives you hope for a rest to come. Or there's no more crying, and there's no more sickness, and there's no more crucifying your flesh. You can rest from it all. Because let's face it, this life, it's hard. It's hard. It's difficult. We got challenges that are beyond us, and God helps us through them. And if you're at the point where I've never faced anything I couldn't handle, hey, God bless you. I hope for your sake that's how you go out. But you know what? We don't stay so invincible all of our life. Through Christ, we can do all things. But it comes from Him. I will tell you that I want to encourage you to not ever be tempted for unbelief or skipping over things that He has had significance for in our life, including what we call a Sabbath, to recreate, to recreate, to have a rest, a change of activity or no activity or something different where we recognize that we're not toiling. And it's not just about, man, I really need a physical rest. Oh, man, I just need an emotional repair. Oh, I'm just mentally exhausted. It's not just for that. It's part of what He's done for us. But there's a spiritual aspect that's in motion here that He has purposed for you and I. And the joy in it, and it doesn't make you lazy. You're not supposed to work 7 full days a week and just keep going. You're not supposed to work 16 and a half hours a day every day and then, take 6 hours to sleep, and that leaves you an hour and a half to include your meals and have meaningful relationships. We've talked about this and alluded to it, and some of it has come out of some of your mouths, this COVID thing. In some ways, we've had to work harder. In other ways, it has forced you to close off things because they weren't available. And especially those with family and kids, you go, man, how were we living before? We have spent more time with our children and doing things, and family values and spiritual life has restored to some of the families who've recognized it and initiated this. Why? Because it's been a Sabbath rest that you recognized. Imagine if we take that honorable and holy Sabbath rest that He has purposed, and we honor it in our life, how much healthier and further along we'd be with the Lord and maybe relationship. If you're saying, oh no, I've got it, man, I got to work this 7 days, I got to do this, I got a lot to do, I got to do, you know what? I will just tell you that is disobedience because you're not trusting the Lord. You're taking everything into your own hands. There's a time to work. There's a time to get an ox out of the ditch. And we should work hard, and we should work smart, and we should, we answer to Him. But we also answer to Him about a rest and a Sabbath and the spiritual part of that, not just the physical, mental. Oh, I'm not that tired. I'm not that exhausted. I can go more. Well, that's great. Hallelujah. But that doesn't mean you don't take a Sabbath rest. It means that you don't understand what a Sabbath rest is. You're looking at it purely from how you feel and physically and not from the spiritual principle at work. And therefore, that is offensive to God. And so these are the 5 little time phrases. I want you to go ahead and stand up. I'm going to share a couple things with you as you're standing. One is, if you're here and life is just right now you are exhausted. Maybe you're caring for children, you're caring for your folks, you're got a job, you're trying to do the household, you're trying to have meaningful relationships, and you got all this stuff, and you got to, be a good Christian, whatever that means in your mind, and you're just now you're homeschooling some of you, and you're like, I've told that to several people. They said, well, what about Wednesday nights in the kids ministry? I said, we're gonna hopefully get there. We're gonna just little by little here. I said, you think you had exhausted parents bringing kids in before when they were going to school? Now you watch some of these exhausted mothers come in on a Wednesday night, and they're homeschooling in addition to all the other stuff they were doing. You want to see exhausted mothers? You do, open Wednesday night up. It's a big lifestyle change. So, anyhow, that was just a side note. It wasn't really part of the message. So some of you exhausted, I want you to listen to this, okay? It's Jesus speaking, and it's in Matthew chapter 11, and He says this, come to me. You could have a whole message just on those 3 words. Come to me. I don't know where you're looking. I don't know what you're looking for, but Jesus is saying, come to me, all of you, any of you, who labor and are heavy laden or burdened. Come to me. I will give you what? Rest. Rest. And it's holy. It's not just good. It's not just very good. It's holy. So Jesus says, so if you're going through something like that, or you set this, in my mind, yeah, I got to remember this because I'm probably going to get there one day or more days. Come to Him. Those of you who have been working, who are laboring, who haven't known a Sabbath. Maybe some of you are saying, I'm not employed anymore. But you have a physical disability or inhibition, and it just wears you out. You don't ever get good rest. You don't ever have a Sabbath. It's not like 6 days you hurt. Well, today's the Sabbath day, so all my pain goes away, and then tomorrow it'll start again on Monday or Sunday or however you count your Sabbath. You never have a day of rest. You never do. You get chronic pain. Come to Him because you're burdened. You're oppressed with this thing. And He is the Lord of the Sabbath. And He will do work on the Sabbath for you. That's why He was criticized. He healed on the Sabbath. The religious community got all upset. Jesus worked on the Sabbath. Do you know why? Because His ox was in a ditch. You, me. We needed rescuing. That's how much He cares about you. We're supposed to make things right in us. So I'm going to close with this verse because you and I all have a responsibility in this. It's in this passage in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12. It says, take care, brothers, sisters, the household of God. Take care, lest there be any of you, unless there be an evil in any of you. What is it? An unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. Unbelief will begin to slowly lead you there. Not honoring what He's put in motion. Not remembering a promise of rest. And what that spiritual principle does for us in this life, but also fueling us for an eternal rest. But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Here's our responsibility. It says that we're supposed to exhort, encourage one another every day. Let me ask you this. Who did you encourage in a spiritual truth yesterday? Who? Is anybody? Well, I didn't really see anybody, and I didn't really... do you have a spouse? Do you have a child? Were you on Facebook for, 3 hours? Did you encourage anybody? So that we can help throw seeds of faith their way. I mean, it's our responsibility to do that. Everybody has their own responsibility whether to believe or not. That's their choice. We can't control that. But our responsibility is that every day, somebody, every day, while it is called today, if God gives us tomorrow and we get to tomorrow, what do we call tomorrow? Today. What do we call Tuesday if we get there? Today. For as long as we call it today, we're supposed to encourage them and exhort them so that they will not slowly slip away and be deceived into unbelief, that they will not remember the promise of rest and the promise of being rescued in this life. And God set it up from the very beginning, and that we just sail through Sabbaths thinking, well, it's just for us physically, emotionally, and we don't honor what's holy. To recreate instead of work and work. I'm going to tell you something. If your significance comes from work, I want you to know, God give you long life, there's going to be a last day of work for you. Whatever title you have, it's going to go away one day. I've been around long enough to watch this happen for people. That they lose their title, they lose their job, or they retire. Listen, I'm taking notes, not just for all of you, but for me. If God give me long life, there's going to be a last day that I pastor. And if all of my significance was based upon what I did, and then it's gone, I'm going to crash. I'm going to be lost. I'm going to have all kinds of mental, emotional problems. Because I didn't find my significance in who I am as a person, as God looks at me, and how I'm supposed to live before Him. Whether my title is, the trash guy, or the attorney, or the architect, or the factory labor person, or the it doesn't matter, or I spent my whole life in the home. Those things are great and they can fuel us, but understand, you are one day closer to that title slipping away. Our significance has to be found in Him and how we relate to Him and how He loves us and cares for us. Not the work. The work is important. It's part of our worship. But it is not who I am. I pastor. But I'm Randy. And who is that guy? Am I going to be lost when you guys finally get sick of me? Or am I going to be okay? How about you? Our work is our worship. Our rest is our worship. And if you don't honor God in these two things and have this good ebb and flow and this rhythm between work and rest, like God Himself, we're in violation. So you have to change your mind about some things. And some of you need to get working. And you need to remember on your job, you're working for the Lord. So whether you're frustrated with the company or not and you think they don't deserve you to do a good job, you answer to somebody bigger than them. Whether you think you need a physical, emotional, mental rest or not, it's part of your worship. So get it right. Let's get it right. Let's be healthy. Be a healthy church so we can be the living church here on earth, being fruitful and not in violation.